Welcome. We're glad you're joining us this evening. We are going to bring in Amy Green, WMFE News environmental reporter, and esteemed panelists in a moment for a conversation about the massive plan to save the Everglades. And then we'll open up the floor for questions. But first, let me give you a bit of background on tonight's conversation. My name's Matthew Petty. I am moderating and hosting this conversation. And let me tell you what you're going to hear about. In the final days of President Bill Clinton's administration, back in 2000, he signed into law a plan to restore the Everglades. 20 years and $17 billion later, the grandiose vision of reversing decades of environmental damage remains stuck in the swamp. Now, tonight you will get to hear from WMFE's Amy Green, who spent 10 years researching and writing a book about the restoration, and two of its most influential and unlikely proponents, George and Mary Barley. Her book, Moving Water, is due to be published March 2nd by Johns Hopkins University Press. And her research and reporting led to Drained, a WMFE podcast in partnership with the Florida Center for Investigative Reporting. Joining the conversation this evening is Trevor Aronson. He is the Executive Director of the Florida Center for Investigative Reporting. It's a non-profit news organization. We're also joined by Mary Barley, who is the founding director of the Everglades Foundation, a non-profit working to protect and restore America's Everglades. Now, there's a lot to cover, and that's why we're here today. We thank you for taking the time to be here, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say. Once we hear from the panelists, we will open the floor for a Q&A portion of the evening. Now, you can feel free to submit your questions or comments at any time using the Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll get as many of those questions answered as we can. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Amy Green, Trevor Aronson, and Mary Barley. Panelists, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Amy, I want to start with you. Take us inside your book, Moving Water. The book tells the story of George and Mary Barley. George Barley was a wealthy Central Florida real estate developer and a very influential Everglades advocate. Now, his wife, Mary Barley, took up the cause after his death in 1995. We're going to hear from her in a moment, but first, Amy, what got you interested in this story?
Right. So I first met Mary Barley back in 2008, and I was covering big news at the time in this long story of Everglades restoration. The governor at the time, Charlie Crist, had announced this monumental deal where the state would buy out U.S. Sugar Corp, and U.S. Sugar Corp is the nation's oldest and largest sugar producer, and the state would put the land toward Everglades restoration. And U.S. Sugar Corp is part of this large farming community south of Lake Okeechobee in the Everglades agricultural area. And so this was a huge story at the time. This was before I was a radio reporter at WMFE, and I started working on an article for Newsweek magazine about the Everglades Foundation, which is just a powerhouse of a nonprofit in Everglades restoration. And I called Mary Barley to get some background information on the Everglades Foundation. And of course, Mary's late husband, George Barley, established the Everglades Foundation. And so during the course of this interview, Mary Barley told me the story of the Everglades Foundation and how it came about. And this, of course, was in many ways her own biography. She had been so, closely and deeply involved in this. And I could immediately see that this was just a great story and that Mary Barley had led just an extraordinary life. And so a few weeks later, I drove down to Isla Mirada in the Florida Keys, which is where Mary Barley lives. And I did another article, personality profile on Mary for the Christian Science Monitor. And then a few years later, I called Mary Barley and asked whether she might be interested in me writing a book about her life. And she said yes.
And you've had a sort of singular obsession with the Everglades. Amy, you and I have talked at length about this in the time that I've known you at WMFE. That's been a topic of conversation in the newsroom many times. What is it about the Glades that you find so fascinating?
Right. So I talk about this a little bit in Moving Water and also in the podcast Drained. And I think I just have a very analytical mind. And for me, as I say in the podcast, the Everglades are kind of like this Rubik's Cube that I can't put down. It's like this puzzle. It's so complicated. You ask one question and it leads to another and another and another. But really what got me hooked was this article that I did many years ago with Mary Barley for the Christian Science Monitor. I can remember being in Everglades National Park with Mary Barley and a scientist for the Everglades Foundation, Tom Van Lent. And I can remember Tom telling me a story about the construction of a highway through the Everglades. And this was back in the day. The highway was the first to give Ford Model Ts access to Flamingo in the Southern Everglades. And after the construction of this highway, they noticed that the vegetation on one side of the highway was changing and was different than it was on the other side of the highway. And over time, they figured out that, in the Everglades, it's such a sensitive ecosystem that this highway had changed the course of water enough, to dramatically change the vegetation of the ecosystem. And I just at the time was like, wow, this is incredible. And right then and there, I was hooked, and I just wanted to learn everything I could about the Everglades.
Now, Mary Barley, I wanted to bring you into this conversation because you've been involved in Everglades advocacy for 25 years. I mean, that's a long time. That's been your life for that long. Why are you so focused on it, and what has kept you involved over all these years?
Well, George and I were avid fly fishermen. We spent a lot of time in the Florida Keys. And when we came down here and saw what was happening to Florida Bay, we just said we have to go to work to save it. And that's exactly what we did. And then when he died in the airplane crash in 1995, on his way, he was actually going to an Everglades meeting in Jacksonville with the Army Corps of Engineers. And that was really the beginning of my Everglades journey. And, I came to Florida 50 years ago. And from the first time I saw it, I loved it. And I thought, I am never leaving this place. And Florida Bay is still my favorite place. And I'm committed. I'm just committed to the Everglades. I always have been. I always will be. And it's because if you give up, you lose. And that's why I'm never going to give up on the Everglades.
It's kind of a hard thing to love, though, right? The Everglades. I mean, it's not a very hospitable environment to fall in love with. There's mosquitoes, there's kind of alligators that can get you, giant pythons. It's a pretty wild place.
Well, yeah, it is wild, but then there's some incredibly beautiful places like Florida Bay. Florida Bay used to be like an aquarium. You could go out, drive around in your boat and look over and see sawfish, swordfish, tarpon, bonefish, any kind of fish you can think of. There's 2,000 species here in the Everglades. You can, there's photography, you can hike, you can bird, whatever you want. You can python hunt even, right? So whatever you want to do, whatever is your favorite hobby and whatever makes you happy, you can go to the Everglades and you can find it. But it's also, don't ever forget your drinking water too.
Right, so a critically important ecosystem, as Amy pointed out, and important for the health and security, I guess, of all Floridians. I want to continue this conversation, about the book, Mary Barley, but just before we do, let me pivot back to Trevor Aronson for a moment. Trevor, a lot of what you do with the Center for Investigative Reporting is you're investigating kind of the things that people are doing, events. Is it interesting to work on a project where the main character is a place rather than a person?
Yeah, I mean, telling the story of a place or a non-human being is obviously challenging from a narrative perspective, right? And I think that was the challenge Amy had in this podcast, in this book, certainly. But I think, I think you can, I think what Amy tried to do, and I think where we succeeded to some degree in the podcast, is kind of showing that despite not being a person, the Everglades is this kind of character in itself, right? It's this enormous ecosystem with this crazy story of like wildlife, including invasive wildlife, like the pythons that Mary mentioned. And I think it's just this, iconic symbol of Florida. But I also think, and the reason I think Amy's reporting is so important is that, I think for a lot of Floridians, they obviously know of the Everglades, and but they don't really know what the Everglades truly is and what restoration has meant. And I say this as a native Floridian. I remember going on Alligator Alley on road trips with my parents when it was like one lane each way. And so I've been all of my life familiar with the Everglades, and I'm also well read, and I've read all these stories about Everglades restoration. But I have to admit, when I started talking to Amy about this project and doing her reporting as a podcast, I really felt like I don't know like what it means to restore the Everglades, right? Like I've read a bunch of stories about it, like what does restoration look like, and how are we restoring it, and how of the ways that we've changed the Everglades are we doing now to change it again. And I think that's where Amy's reporting is really important, because I think so many Floridians take for granted that they know a lot about the Everglades, and I think actually very few of us really do. And it's such an important ecological system that I think Floridians really should know more about it. And I think Amy's reporting on the subject is a way of kind of educating a lot of Floridians about this hugely important part of Florida that they probably don't know as much about as they think.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me come back to you for a moment, Mary Barley. What is it like having somebody write a book about your life?
Well, I think it was pretty terrifying. It was very overwhelming. And but you know what? There's so many other people who deserve to be thought of and are responsible for making this restoration happen. It's not just me. It's about all of us, Amy included, who make a big difference in as we move forward and how Everglades restoration will be when it's finished.
Mm-hmm. Amy Green, let's just dig into the writing process a little bit, because writing any kind of book is a pretty monumental undertaking. And you spent 10 years working on it, researching it. What did you learn about it in the course of writing Moving Water?
Right. Well, Moving Water is the first book to tell the story of George and Mary Barley. And George Barley was just this dynamo of an Everglades activist who, at the time of his death, his stature was, probably on the level of the Secretary of the Interior at the time. He just was a torpedo on the issue, and he was really the first activist who was able to bring real resources to the table. Before George Barley, there were many people engaged on that issue very passionately, but no one really with the deep pockets to go toe to toe with other political interests, like, sugar growers, big sugar, as we say in the political parlance, who were just extraordinarily powerful in the legislature, in Congress, and who many saw as very reluctant in toward progress in Everglades restoration. George Barley, as you said, Matt, was a wealthy real estate investor in Central Florida, very politically connected, and he was really the first who was able to bring those resources, bring those connections to the table on behalf of the Everglades. And unfortunately, he died very tragically in a plane crash in 1995. And after his death, Mary Barley, within weeks, really, took up his cause, and in 96 engaged in a ballot initiative that was aimed at taxing sugar growers to raise money for Everglades restoration. And at the time, this was a political campaign that was the most expensive in Florida history. And in some ways it succeeded, in some ways it was not successful. And today, Mary Barley remains very influential and very involved through the Everglades Foundation and the Everglades Trust, which you may remember the Everglades Trust gave Governor Ron DeSantis a very critical endorsement as he ran his campaign for governor on an environmental platform. Excuse me. Were you going to ask a question? I didn't mean to move on. I just was going to add, Moving Water also is the first book to really document the influence of Paul Tudor Jones in Everglades restoration. And Paul Tudor Jones is a very, very wealthy real estate investor, or excuse me, he's a Wall Street tycoon, really. And he was George Barley's best friend. And he almost single-handedly funded a lot of this very important political work back in the 1990s, the 96 ballot initiative that Mary Barley led, and almost single-handedly funded Audubon's first Everglades position in South Florida. Paul Tudor Jones did this while really shying away from media attention. And so that is another aspect of Everglades history that many people may not be aware of.
Right, and I'm sure as a writer and reporter, somebody who has that much influence but is a little bit media shy, I mean, that's going to be an interesting subject to write about. Speaking of investigations, Trevor Aronson, let me bring you back into this conversation. I mean, this is not the first project that you have worked with Amy Green on. You've worked on stories about the influence of the sugar industry in Florida before. I'm wondering, just as you watched Amy work on this particular project through the years, reporting on the Everglades, what have been some of the most surprising things that have come to light for you about this place in South Florida?
Yeah, I think the first project we worked with Amy on was maybe 2012 or 13. And it was about money, Big Sugar's political influence through contributions, right? And again, I think this is another aspect of Florida that Floridians don't fully appreciate, which is the size and vast wealth of Big Sugar in the United States, and its willingness to put that wealth behind its political purposes and business causes. And so I think I think what's interesting about the Everglades, and I think a lot interesting about Amy's reporting, is that it isn't just this story of this sensitive ecological environment that we have in many ways mishandled, right? It's a story about big business and the competing, the competition between kind of, development and industry versus, preservation and how we strike that balance. And so I think, what attracted us to do, this podcast, most recently was I really felt like it built on all of Amy's reporting over the last decade or so, which is just, in the media environment we're in today, where, there's so much pressure on reporters to do more and more stories every day, that's not kind of a wealth of knowledge that you're often able to kind of tap into. And so I think for that reason, that's why it was incredibly important for us to work with Amy on this project. I mean, to me, some of the most surprising things really came from drains. As I mentioned, I'd read stories about Everglades restoration for as long as I can remember. And I don't think I fully appreciated some of the kind of harebrained schemes that they'd come up with to restore the Everglades, like the aquifer pump and like pumping water down. It's just like, I was not aware of that. And so to me, like that was kind of among the incredible things that we were throwing these millions and millions of dollars at Everglades, restoration. And in many ways, the people restoring the Everglades were kind of really like, what's the cliche? Like they were building the airplane while they were in flight. And that's very much, where we are today, which to me is striking. I kind of came from this initially with the naive impression that the plan to restore the Everglades with all these millions and millions of dollars was much firmer than it really is.
Mm-hmm. Mary Barley, I wonder if, having a reporter work on a book about your life, does that give you a kind of a new perspective on the work that you've been doing over the last quarter century?
Well, I guess it does, actually. It's a little embarrassing, actually. So I don't like to talk about myself in that kind of way. But, I'm just in awe of like the positive comments she's received from the public and her contemporaries on Moving Waters. It's amazing. Restoration is bold, and it's an audacious undertaking with many moving parts and numerous governments and agencies, and there's good and evil, like we've just been talking about. And it's what's amazing to me is that Amy condensed all those years of advocacy into just like a little frank look back. And the look back for me has been, it's a lot of things that I just put out of my mind. I didn't want to think about anymore. And now it reminds me of how difficult the fight is and how difficult it's going to be going forward.
Thinking about that, though, Mary Barley, I mean, you're still clearly very passionate about the Everglades, and obviously that spirit has not waned over the years. But sort of thinking about the work that's gone into it and the challenges that you faced along the way, do you think, knowing what you know now, you would have blithely set out on this path 25 years ago?
I have no idea. I like to think that I would have, but I don't know. It has been very difficult at times, but then it's been so rewarding that why would you ever want to give up? Every little project is a success.
Yeah, and I guess there's so many things about environmental restoration where the hazards and the barriers seem so high. So I guess any kind of advance must seem like a pretty big deal.
Yes, and if you really look around and study it, you'll find out that every ecosystem is exactly like ours. It has the exact same problems that the Everglades does. And if we can be successful, that's what's going to be the greatest gift we could give to the planet, is if we are successful, then many, many other ecosystems will know what to do and how to do it.
Amy, when you came back from the reporting that you'd done on your book, you essentially had a list of questions. You had kind of like a notebook full of ideas. And, you know, in the newsroom, we like to bounce ideas off each other. And I remember distinctly having one conversation with you where you essentially just presented me with a list of things about the Everglades. And you're like, I want to do more reporting on this. Let's do a project. Just kind of walk us through what that process was like.
Right. So, my deadline for my manuscript was December 31st, 2019. And so 2019, I was writing pretty furiously. And by the end of that year, I was writing like I have never written in my life. And there was a moment when I was on deadline with the book and I was, researching all this Everglades restoration stuff, and it's very complicated. And I was making a million phone calls, and I stopped, and I thought, this is really messed up. And I stopped and I made a list of all the ways that Everglades restoration is messed up, kind of, like climate change and some other things. And just a few weeks after that, I listened to a podcast from a very fascinating podcast from the Kentucky Center for Investigative Reporting and Louisville Public Radio called The Dig. And that's how I got the idea for Drained. And so we ended up doing a 4-episode miniseries podcast timed to drop in December 2020, which is the 20-year anniversary of Everglades restoration being signed into law. And each episode looked at a component of Everglades restoration. We did one on water storage, one on flow, climate change, and water quality. And so that was how that came about.
It was interesting to me. I mean, obviously, and we discussed this a little bit before about how the Everglades is kind of like a personality in and of itself, right? It's like this living organism. It's kind of hard to wrap your arms around. I mean, it's literally enormous, and it's this massively complicated system that you can't really grasp unless you spend a very long time researching it. But it was interesting to me also kind of reflecting on some of the sounds we heard in the podcast, Amy, and especially some of the political voices from 20 years plus ago, like especially that speech that President Bill Clinton made in the waning days of his administration. Of course, all eyes were on Florida at that point. This is 2000, and that was because we'd gone through the kind of election debacle of that year. But here was Bill Clinton making this speech, this kind of grandiose speech about how this project was going to save the Glades, and it would be. He sort of referenced other natural wonders across the United States. And it's interesting to reflect how far we've come in those 20 years and just how intractable in some ways the problem is. I mean, all the money that's been poured into it, and there's still much more work to do. Do you kind of have a sense, Amy, having spent this time reporting on it, that you feel like where this project is headed and what the next chapter might be?
It's very complicated, and I would not pretend to be an environmental or a water engineer or anything like that. But you're right, Matt. You know, when this was signed into law in December 2000, no one had ever seen anything like this. You know, at the time, this was billed as the largest environmental restoration effort anywhere in the world ever. And today, it is still one of the most ambitious attempts at ecological restoration in the world. And so in many ways, no one has ever seen anything like this. You know, the effort is composed of 68 projects, and each project on its own is just monumental. You know, one of the most important projects is a reservoir south of Lake Okeechobee, and that plan has been altered a little bit through the years, but when construction first started on that reservoir, it was going to be the largest reservoir of its kind in the world. You know, they're building filter marshes, which are, you know, human engineered wetlands, and they clean the water as the water flows through these wetlands. The vegetative tissues absorb the pollutants, and over time, the water flows cleaner. And these are wetlands that are the largest of their kind in the world. So this is, you know, you know, something that really stretches the imagination in many ways.
Mm-hmm. Trevor, you were talking before, or you alluded to some of the kind of mind-bogglingly strange, in some ways, ideas to solve some of the problems of the Everglades, including pumping vast quantities of water underground to try and deal with some of that runoff. And we also hear some sound from a kind of promotional movie that was made, you know, decades ago, right? And I wondered, Trevor, just kind of reflecting on this as a podcast producer, as an investigative reporter, what do you think about when you hear some of the voices from last century when they were kind of just getting started on engineering this to kind of suit human needs at the time?
Yeah, I mean, to me, like that the promotional video from the 50s or whatever it was, I mean, it strikes me as kind of like the old manifest destiny, right? This idea that like we as humans and Americans can just manipulate the earth however we want, and we'll be fine. It'll be fine. And it turns out that I think, you know, obviously we didn't do a very good job, right? Like we drained the Everglades and allowed for development, and then we created a host of other problems that we are now grappling with through the last 20 years of restoration. But I think what was so interesting to me, you know, is that like that kind of arrogance, this idea that, you know, we can manipulate the earth as we want, you know, is a lesson we didn't clearly learn from, right? Because one of the solutions, you know, proposed at one point was this idea of like pumping the water into the aquifer, right? You know, damn the consequences kind of thing, even though, you know, that would have kind of clearly risked the drinking water quality of the aquifer itself, right? And so, you know, I mean, I don't, just like Amy said, you know, I don't pretend to be an environmental engineer or someone who, you know, knows what that answer is. But I was just struck by, you know, how badly, you know, how many terrible problems we created through draining the Everglades, and that in many ways the solutions that we came up with, you know, raise questions about even worse problems that we might have in the future, or similar, or whether that we were just trading one problem for another. And to me, that was really fascinating. I mean, I understand that this is a terribly complex problem, and it's difficult to kind of boil it down and point out some of these absurd plans. But at the same time, it's clear that, you know, we really haven't fully learned the lesson of, you know, maybe we shouldn't mess with the environment as much as we did.
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I feel like you don't need to be an environmental engineer. I mean, obviously that would help to kind of give you a sense of just exactly what's going on here. But we're all living in Florida, right? We're residents of the state. And I think the thing that struck me, one of the things that struck me about the podcast, having kind of come to the end of the project and listening back to it, is this really does affect everyone. I mean, you don't have to even live in South Florida to know that there is going to be some impact from what happens in the Everglades, whether it's restoration, whether it's, you know, if plans don't go quite right, because people keep moving to Florida, there's going to be a need for water, and that need is not going away. And, you know, what happens in the river of grass, whatever happens in the next 10, 20 years, is going to have an impact on all of us.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, what's fascinating to me, obviously, is that, you know, I think anyone who's paying attention understands that Florida is in a very precarious situation with climate change, right? And the conversation that is often talked about, which is important, is sea level rise and what areas of the state will be habitable in the long term and how we can mitigate all of this. But the secondary conversation, which this deals with it, which I don't think is happening enough, is what is the drinking water supply going to be like? How is climate change going to be affecting that? There may still be many patches of land to live on in Florida, but what we'll be doing for water at that point. And again, which is why I was like, so, my mind was so boggled by the idea of like pumping dirty water into the aquifer, right? Like, well, that's your idea for saving it. I mean, because you're, essentially kind of creating another problem. But you're right. I mean, I think, this gets us the larger conversation of climate change, but, I think, the Florida's ecosystem is so interconnected that these programs are really something that we should be paying attention to when we think about like the future habitability of our state.
Mm-hmm. Mary Barley, just thinking about that 20-year mark since the Everglades restoration plan was signed into law, what's your take on where we are now? And I'm wondering too, do you reflect on what George Barley would think about all of this?
Well, I think where we are now highlights how dysfunctional and transactional our government is. Not only the political actors, but also a lot of the bureaucrats who contribute to the delays. And so, the scale is staggering, but I still think that restoration can be achieved. And further to what Trevor said, I mean, water is our base, our economic basis in Florida is tourism.
Mm-hmm.
And water. If we don't have water, we don't have tourism. That means all of Florida, not just South Florida, not just the Everglades. And so we have to be thinking, Everglades is a huge ecosystem, but then we have to go up to the next level and get out of the box and, think big. But it takes political will from all our governments, tribal, local, state, federal, and public participants to move these immovable objects. And George, I think he would have been incensed at the slow pace, and he would be demanding accountability.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, Mary Barley, the Everglades need right at this moment?
It needs the political will and funding. We need $725 million for the next 4 years from the federal government. We need a matching fund from the state of Florida. It's a 50-50 partnership. And that would probably finish 90% of the projects. But you can't finish these projects with dribble and drab of money. You have to it's like a mortgage. You have to know that you can build the whole house or you can't even start it. And so that is one big problem with the Everglades, obviously, is how do we get the money, which is really important. And we get the money by having people like us demand that they do this restoration and they do it properly and they do it scientifically, not just for people, but they do it for critters and the environment too.
Mm-hmm. Amy Green, what's next for you as far as reporting on the Everglades? I get the sense that the reporting isn't quite done yet.
Right. Yeah. I'm totally obsessed with it. And I can't help myself. I think I may have shared with you in the past, Matt, that over the holidays, I took my 7-year-old daughter down to the Everglades. She has been home with me during the pandemic and has been hearing me work on the podcast and on the book. And she said that she wanted to see the Everglades for herself. And so I said, okay. And my mother and I took her down to the Everglades, and I just, went to the library and was looking for some books for her and just got the idea for writing a children's book for children about the Everglades. So I just kind of can't stop.
So we are going to open up the floor for your questions and comments. Now you can submit through the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We are going to answer as many of those questions as we can. First question comes from Joshua Hurton. I'm pronouncing your name right there, Joshua. And the question is, what role do we see the Everglades playing with climate change? Which of our panelists would like to grab that one.
Well, it's a big carbon sink. And so if we do it right, and what we're doing now is wrong, because now we're, the carbon is being released astronomically, because peat is a big carbon sink. And so if we don't take care of it, and the only way you can stop that is by having it have the water flowing back where it does not dry out. And of course, when it dries out, we have fires, which is another carbon problem. So it is if you really think about it, millions of acres, where are you going to find millions of acres for a carbon sink? And that's not including Florida Bay and the ocean, the Gulf and ocean side of it, because seagrasses are big carbon sinks too, and so are mangroves.
Mm-hmm. Amy, you've done quite a bit of reporting on sort of land purchases and how some of that's factored into this as well. Is that the way to go? Is it just a matter of state government buying up land?
Yeah, in some ways, I would add to the climate change question. We get into this in the podcast a little bit. One thing that we're seeing in the Everglades is a literal collapse of the Everglades as saltwater intrusion. And, as saltwater is flowing deeper into those freshwater marshes, it's causing those freshwater marshes to collapse. And what's left behind is patches of open water. And so what you're seeing in the Everglades is land loss. And this is important because, as Mary said, the Everglades is an extremely important carbon sink. It also serves as a natural buffer against hurricanes, protecting inland structures from the destructive forces of hurricanes as they come ashore. And then obviously the problem of, land loss. And so one thing that's happening now, or one thing we're learning with Everglades restoration, is that when Everglades restoration was approved back in 2000, if you can think back to 2000, climate change seemed a little less urgent then than it does now, especially in South Florida. And so Everglades restoration was based on historical environmental patterns in the Everglades. Well, we now are learning that as we go about Everglades restoration, we need to plan for future changes in South Florida. And so there is an effort to change Everglades restoration in some ways, or update it to account for these changes that we're seeing with climate change.
Mm-hmm. Trevor, I wanted to just check in with you because, as a reporter and editor, you're sort of thinking, one tends to think about, how do we tell a story that makes sense to people? A story as big and complex as climate change can be a little bit hard to give people a sense of perspective on, right? How do you approach this, and how do you feel like the Everglades factors into telling the story of climate change?
Yeah, so climate change is such an enormously complicated topic that sometimes the best thing to do when you're trying to tell that story is to kind of slice off the pieces that are manageable to tell. And then, separately there's always the kind of story to be told about how, politicians and policy are confronting with climate change. I do think, as part of, I think the Everglades really should be part of a larger kind of national conversation about climate change in a way that I don't think we've had, but there have been hints at that. So, as a kind of reminder, in 2015, my former colleague here at FCIR, Tristan Corton, reported on how the Rick Scott administration had banned the use of global warming and climate change. And what was notable was that, within weeks, I think, President Obama had flown down to the Everglades and gave this long speech on why it was important for governments and politicians around the world to confront climate change and use the Everglades as his natural backdrop. And I think, since then, I don't recall kind of the Everglades being such a focal point of a national conversation about climate change. But I think, Amy's podcast is kind of a part of kind of helping to establish that, I think, since then, which I think as we talk about climate change more in Florida, we shouldn't just restrict it to, hey, Miami Beach is flooding, right? That's the story we always hear. In fact, climate change is affecting all parts of the state in ways that many people don't appreciate. And the Everglades in particular is being affected. And so, even though climate change as this topic is this hugely complicated thing to talk about. I think as reporters and journalists, we can take these smaller stories and use that as a way of talking about the larger issue. And I think that's really the only kind of way to tackle it in a kind of sensible way.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a climate change story or not, but I'm always kind of amused a little bit by the notion that there is a hockey team in South Florida called the Everglades. I mean, it's a great name for a team, but also too, just the notion of people playing hockey in Florida seems a little bit counterintuitive to me. No offense to Tampa Bay listeners, of course. Question coming in as well here. How has the Army Corps of Engineers contributed to the decline of the Everglades, and is their current involvement good or bad? Amy Green, you've done quite a bit of reporting on the Army Corps of Engineers and their work in Florida in terms of water management. What's your take on this?
Right. So we talked earlier during the discussion about this historic film called Waters of Destiny. And for people who are familiar with Everglades history and restoration, this is a very infamous film, which it's a film that came out, around the 1950s. And it was a film, it was a propaganda film, basically, about the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, this massive effort underway at the time to, kind of take control of the Everglades after a series of very tragic hurricanes had come through the state and killed a lot of people. And so the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers were brought in to kind of take control of the Everglades, replumb the Everglades. And we now are experiencing the many consequences of this. Toxic algae is one of those consequences. So as Everglades restoration got off the ground, the federal, and I see you, Mary Barley, the federal agency that was charged with executing this restoration was the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And what is historic about this, what's important about this, is it was kind of the first project for the Army Corps at a time when the Army Corps was trying to transition from this agency of, manifest destiny and all, like in the Mississippi River, to a more green organization, engaged in restoration projects. And the Everglades was the first one for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. There's.
I'm going to defend the Corps, because most people do not know and realize they can never come into your state or your local place without your local politicians bringing them in. They can never, ever do that. So they have to have an agreement with somebody in your state, and your state asks them to come in and do whatever job it is. They don't just come in and say, oh, I think I'm going to go and build a dike around Lake Okeechobee. No, the governor of the state of Florida requested that they come in and do that. And so I think the Corps takes a lot of guff that they don't really deserve. That should be on our political actors who do these things to our environment and other places that a lot of us don't want, but they don't care. They bring them in anyway and say, go ahead and do it. So that's my take on the Corps, and that's what I've learned during Everglades restoration.
Just a housekeeping note here, a reminder, we've got about 15 minutes or so until the end of this presentation. So if you do have questions, please do keep submitting, and we'll try and get as many of those questions answered as we can. A question coming in from Kathy, who writes, which politicians are supportive of the effort? DeSantis seemed supportive early on. Is he still? And I believe that's the environmental restoration effort. And what about others? Thanks for that question, Kathy. Amy Green, what are your thoughts?
Well, yeah. Governor Ron DeSantis, I write in Moving Water, may be, the first statewide candidate to be elected in Florida without the support of Big Sugar. This was a very big change in Florida politics when he ran against the sugar growers and won. He ran, the environment was a very important part of his platform. He comes into the issue, in my view, from a fiscal point of view, recognizing that toxic algae is a huge economic issue for communities that are dependent on tourism. Tourists are not going to come to the state if the water is messed up. So DeSantis certainly has brought an enormous amount of attention to the Everglades, putting millions, hundreds of millions of dollars toward Everglades restoration, on top of his connections to former President Donald Trump, which again helped bring more federal dollars to Everglades restoration. So I would think that many environmental advocates see this as a hopeful time for the Everglades. I would be interested to hear what Mary Barley would add.
Well, I would agree with that. And he's done other things besides, Everglades. He's purchased like 20,000 acres that were going to be drilled on the East Coast. And he replaced the South Florida Water Management District Board, which is one of the agents I was talking about with the Florida Corps. That agency went and got the Corps to come and do what they do to the Everglades. And so how do we, and what is he? I think he's an Everglades superman, really, I do. I've dealt with a lot of politicians, a lot of presidents, a lot of governors, a lot of mayors and legislators. He really, truly has been the only advocate that I know who went toe to toe against Big Sugar and won.
Trevor, I just wanted to make a point here. I mean, one thing that has occurred to me, and I don't know what your thoughts are on this, is I don't recall the last time before DeSantis when we had a gubernatorial candidate who really kind of took those photo ops in the Everglades, right? I mean, I remember that image of him on an airboat. So kind of really centering the Glades as a campaign, part of his campaign platform. I mean, can you think of other statewide candidates for office who've really sort of zeroed in on that as part of their campaign policy in the last 20 years or so?
Yeah, not that I can recall. I mean, other than Obama's speech in 2015, and by then he'd already been elected for his second term, so it was less a political, photo op than just a policy argument. I think what's really fascinating about DeSantis is that, of the Trump-like, political figures we have in this country, he is probably the most Trump-like, right? He had a campaign video where his child was in a, Donald Trump or Make America Great Again, onesie. But where he's kind of gone rogue from kind of Trumpism is on the environment, right? I mean, if you look at Trump's environmental policies on the whole, they were kind of nightmarish in many ways, including opening up drilling in Alaska. And yet, I think, of all of the politicians who are most like him, DeSantis is the one to kind of follow in his political footprint. But I think DeSantis was smart enough to realize that, the environment is critical now for getting elected, which does show this shift. It shows both like a political realignment that, traditionally it had been Democratic politicians pushing for environmental preservation while Republicans pushed for business expansion. And I think now you're seeing, in DeSantis, the realization that, supporting the environment has a huge political upside, so much so, as Mary Barley pointed out, that, it makes it worth going against Big Sugar, which for decades, so many politicians in Florida refused to do.
Mm-hmm. That is actually a good segue to another question here from our viewers. Where do we stand with the U.S. sugar company's involvement in the solution? Mary Barley, what is the role of U.S. sugar in a solution to Everglades restoration?
Well, they're not. The whole thing about Big Sugar is, they're the evil in the Everglades. That's just the bottom line. Their whole purpose is to stop Everglades restoration and delay it in any way that they can. And that's what they have done for 20 years. And they're finding it more and more difficult as more and more people understand, through Amy's Drain and her book and others, and Trevor, it's a long campaign to get the public to understand an issue as complicated as this. But now they get it. They got it when they saw all the algae blooms and they were toxic. They got it when we're having all these hurricanes and they're Cat 5s. They get it now. They want clean water and they want their environment clean. And we're not only are we tourism based, we're water based, not just drinking water, but fishing, diving, boating, beaches. That is what Florida is, and it's our economy, and that's the real key. It is the economy of Florida.
Yeah. Time for a couple more questions here. I just did want to bring in Amy on that point, though. I mean, Amy, you have talked to farmers in the Glades quite frequently in the course of your reporting, and there is, I think, some reporting to suggest that some farmers are taking steps to at least talk about the idea of sustainability in their farming practices.
That's right. Farmers have been required to take some steps to protect the Everglades, and these steps are called best management practices. And best management practices include things like limiting the amount of fertilizer that's used on the crops, changing the way water is used to irrigate the crops. Changes in the way water is used to prevent like soil runoff to go into the water and protect water quality that way. And sugar growers also, as part of a state Everglades restoration plan that was approved back in the 90s, have been paying a tax to help with Everglades cleanup. And sugar growers have gone beyond the requirements, and Everglades water quality in most of the Everglades is at the standard or near the standard. A lot of environmental advocates would say that, it's great what the farmers are doing, but it's not enough.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but Amy, that's not quite right either. I mean, this is a subsidized crop to grow in a river. It costs the taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars to keep them dry, to give them water. There's not a best management practice that they could do. And most of them, they don't really do, because if you go out and find out, and if you ever look at, we've reduced it by, it's like voodoo science. That's what they use to get, and the district helps them to put out this stuff. So it's not quite right to let people, I know you're trying to be all fair, and I'm not going to be fair because I dig into this stuff and get it. These guys, they don't want to do anything that touches their bottom line, not even one penny. And I'll tell you what they do. They're sorry that they ever went against us on the penny a pound, because they have spent a lot more money than they ever would have under penny a pound. So that makes me very happy.
I want to bring in a question here, and this will probably be our last question before we wrap up, but there will be some details for how to contact Amy Green and the other panelists if you want to keep the conversation going. But Erin writes, I have a student in 8th grade who wants to go into environmental science. What could she do during her high school years to not only set her on the path to join the field, but is there something she could do as a project to break into the field before she even graduates? That's a pretty comprehensive question. Mary, would you like to try answer that?
I have no idea. I mean, I'm sure there are science groups within their schools that they can join, and I know, and do projects that take them to nationals and even go globally with if they win. So there's many things like that I know, and I know that we also have Everglades literacy. And if your school isn't in the Everglades literacy program, get in touch with us, because it's a fantastic, and it is a STEM program. And I'm sure she would probably love it if her school would adopt it.
One more bonus question, because I think this kind of wraps it up quite nicely. Jeannie writes, what can little people do to help?
Yeah, I think, just, paying attention to the issues, reading the news, listening to the news on WMFE 90.7, just paying attention to what's happening, and staying engaged with your political leaders. Make sure your political leaders know how you feel and what's important to you. And there's so many great organizations involved in these issues, like the Everglades Foundation, the Everglades Trust, Audubon is another one, doing just great work on these issues that could certainly use your support and your help.
Well, that's going to do it for today's program. I'm Matthew Petty, and on behalf of tonight's panelists, WMFE and FCIR, I want to thank you all for your time. Thank you also, of course, to our panelists, WMFE environmental reporter Amy Green, Trevor Aronson, Executive Director for the Florida Center for Investigative Reporting, and Mary Barley, Founding Director of the Everglades Foundation. Thank you all so much for your time this evening. Now, you can connect with Amy Green at agreen@wmfe.org or on Facebook and Twitter. You can also order her book at Johns Hopkins University Press, Amazon, or Barnes & Noble. And you can find Drained, a podcast about the massive plan to save the Everglades, on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. You can also find it over at wmfe.org and fcir.org. Tune to 90.7 WMFE or 89.5 WMFV next Thursday, March 4th at noon to hear this conversation on intersection. Thanks so much for joining us, giving us your feedback, and for being part of our listener-supported community-based station. If you'd like to make a donation to support our work and to strengthen independent journalism in your community, visit wmfe.org. Thanks so much again, and have a great evening.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks so much, everyone.